The third arrow hit her left shoulder blade, and she felt the broadhead punch through muscle like a hot nail driven into wet wood. Elara did not scream. She had stopped screaming at arrows 2 winters ago, when a hunting party from the Ashfall pack had used her for target practice behind the tannery, and she had learned that screaming only made them aim for softer places. She pressed herself tighter against the wooden stockade fence, her body a wall between the iron-tipped shafts and the 7 pups huddled in the council shelter behind her. The smallest one, a boy named Wren, who was barely 4, had his face buried in the hem of her wool coat, and she could feel his hot, terrified breath through the fabric against her hip. Another arrow whistled from the tree line. This one was aimed low at the gap beneath the fence, where 2 of the older pups had been trying to crawl through to escape. Elara dropped to one knee and caught the shaft in her open palm. The broad head sliced clean through the center of her hand, and she watched her own blood run in a thin red line down the arrow's wooden shaft with a kind of detached fascination, the way you might watch a candle gutter in a draught. She snapped the shaft in 2 and tossed the pieces aside. From the tree line, maybe 60 yards out, a voice called through the grey morning fog. Rough, male, amused. "You are making this harder than it needs to be, little Omega. We only want the Whitmore boy. Hand him over, and you can crawl back to whatever hole you sleep in." Elara said nothing. She shifted her weight to cover the gap more completely and felt the arrow in her shoulder grind against bone. Behind her, Wren whimpered. She reached back without looking and found the top of his head with her bloodied hand, and she held it there, gentle the way she'd hold a wounded bird. There were 5 of them in the trees. She could smell them even through the fog and the copper scent of her own blood. Sweat and pine resin and the sour chemical bite of wolfsbane-laced arrows. Mercenaries. Someone had hired mercenaries to come after a child in the pup council, and if Elara thought about who and why right now, she would lose focus, and if she lost focus, one of these children would die. So she didn't think about it. She counted arrows instead. 3 in her body. 1 in her hand. 1 in the fence post, 6 inches from her head. 1 buried in the dirt at her feet. 6 shots fired from what sounded like 2 bows. If they were carrying standard quivers that left roughly 18 arrows between them, and the shelter behind her was made of pine planks, and prayer nothing more. She could not fight 5 mercenaries. She was a 23-year-old Omega who weighed 112 pounds soaking wet, who had not shifted since she was 16, because her wolf had gone quiet, in a way that made the pack healers look at her with pity, and the pack warriors look at her with contempt. She had no claws, no fangs, no pack, standing no allies. What she had was a job. 3 days a week she watched the pups of the Greymore pack, while their parents worked the border patrols and the lumber mills and the trading posts, and she was paid in scraps from the communal kitchen and a sleeping mat in the storage room beneath the council hall. It was not a life anyone would choose, but the pups were warm, and they laughed at her stories, and they did not care that she was the weakest wolf in 6 territories. She would not let anyone hurt them. The fog shifted. She heard boots on wet leaves. They were moving closer, spreading out to flank the shelter, and her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in the wound in her shoulder, each beat pushing a fresh pulse of blood down her back. Then she felt something else, entirely. It came from the north, from the direction of the mountain pass, and it hit her like a wall of heat in a cold room. A presence, massive and ancient, and so saturated with dominance that her knees buckled before her brain could process what was happening. Her wolf, that silent, dormant thing curled somewhere in the base of her skull, stirred for the first time in 7 years and made a sound she had never heard it make before. Not a growl, not a whine, a purr. The mercenaries felt it too. She saw the nearest one freeze mid-step, his bow half drawn, his face going white beneath the grime. He was looking past her, over her head, toward the ridge that overlooked the council grounds, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has just realized he is standing in the wrong story. Ilara turned her head. He was standing on the ridge in the pale grey light, and he was the largest wolf she had ever seen in human form, well over 6.5 feet wide through the shoulders and chest, in a way that had nothing to do with vanity, and everything to do with violence, wearing black leather and dark iron mail that caught no shine in the foggy morning. His hair was black and fell past his jaw. His face was angular, hard-planed, scarred across the left cheek from some old blade. His eyes were amber, not brown, not hazel, amber like pine sap held up to firelight, and they were locked on her with an intensity that made the arrows in her body feel like a secondary concern. Behind him, emerging from the tree line in perfect formation, came his war council. 20 wolves at least, armed and armored in dark metal, moving with the coordinated silence of a predator formation she had only heard about in stories. The Shadow Ridge Pack, the most feared fighting force on the continent, led by their Alpha King Kalen Voss, the man who had ended the border wars by killing 3 rival alphas in single combat over the span of a week. He was looking at her. No, he was looking at the arrows in her. The amber of his eyes bled to black. She watched it happen in real time, the iris swallowed by the pupil, the gold consumed by something darker and older, and a sound came from his chest that was not a human sound. It was low and sustained, and it vibrated through the ground beneath her knees, through the wooden fence, through the air itself, and every pup behind her went dead silent, because even children know what the earth sounds like before it opens. The nearest mercenary dropped his bow and ran. He made it 4 steps before one of the Shadow Ridge wolves, a massive red-haired woman with a battle-axe slung across her back, caught him by the throat and lifted him off the ground with one arm. The other 4 scattered into the trees. They did not get far. But Kalen Voss didn't look at the mercenaries, did not look at his wolves, did not issue a single order. He came down the ridge in long, unhurried strides, his eyes never leaving Ilara, and the closer he got, the stronger that wave of heat became, until she could feel it in her teeth, in the roots of her hair, in some deep cellular place that had nothing to do with thought. He stopped 3 feet in front of her, close enough that she could smell him. Cedar smoke and iron and something beneath both, something warm and living like the inside of a forest after rain, and her wolf was pressing against the inside of her skull with a desperation that frightened her. He studied her face, then the arrow in her shoulder, then her hand, still bleeding, still wrapped around the broken shaft, then her face again. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask what had happened. The first words out of his mouth, spoken in a voice like gravel dragged across slate, were these: "How many times have they done this to you?" It was not a question. The inflection was flat. He was not asking because he was curious. He was asking because he was counting. Ilara opened her mouth, closed it. She was suddenly viscerally aware that she was kneeling in the dirt with blood running down her arm and her coat torn and her hair matted to her face with sweat and fog, looking up at the most powerful wolf alive. And her wolf was singing. "I am fine," she said. His jaw tightened. A muscle flexed beneath the scar on his cheek. "That is not what I asked." Behind her, Wren peered around her hip and stared up at Kalen with enormous brown eyes. The Alpha King's gaze flicked down to the boy. Something changed in his face. Just for a moment. a hairline fracture in the stone. Then he looked at Ilara's hand, at the blood still dripping from the hole the arrow had punched through her palm, and he looked at the way she was positioned between the pups and the direction the arrows had come from, and she watched him put it together. "You caught one," he said, "with your bare hand." It was aimed at them, she said, as if that explained everything. For Kalen Voss it did. He reached down and took her wounded hand in both of his. His hands were huge, rough-palmed, calloused across the knuckles, warm in a way that made the fog feel colder by contrast. He turned her hand over and looked at the wound in her palm with the careful attention of a man reading a map. She flinched, not from pain, from the contact. When was the last time anyone had touched her without intent to harm? She could not remember, and his touch was sending something through her nervous system that she had no framework for, a cascading warmth that started where his skin met hers and radiated outward through her wrist, her arm, her chest settling behind her sternum like a second heartbeat. Mater Wolf said, and the word was so clear and so loud in her head that she was certain he could hear it. He could, not the word. But the bond, she saw it in the way his breath caught, the way his pupils dilated further, the way his grip on her hand tightened by a fraction before he consciously forced himself to be gentle. "Who do you belong to?" he said. "No one." The words came out before she could think about them, and they were the truest words she had ever spoken. She belonged to no one. She was Greymoor's ghost, their least wolf, the omega they tolerated, because someone had to watch the pups, and no one with any standing would take the job. She ate last, slept in the storage room, and the only names she was called by were functional or cruel. Kalen's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes ignited, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a register that was almost subsonic. "You do now." The red-haired woman from his war council approached, dragging the captured mercenary by the collar. She stopped a respectful distance away and waited. Kalen did not release Ilara's hand. "Rowan," he said, without turning. "My king, bring me the Greymoor Alpha. Now." She vanished into the fog. Ilara's stomach lurched. The Greymoor Alpha. Holden Thorpe, the man who had assigned her to pup duty 3 years ago and had not spoken directly to her since. The man who collected tithes from the Shadow Ridge Pack's border trade, and who would be at this very moment sitting in his oak-panelled study, eating soft-boiled eggs from the porcelain dishes his mate had inherited from her mother, completely unaware that mercenaries had just attacked his pup council. She tried to pull her hand away. Kalen held it. "You need to let me go," she said. "I need to take the pups inside. I need to stop the bleeding. You need to tell me how many scars you have." She stared at him. He was looking at her with that same flat intensity, but there was something working behind his eyes now, some calculation she could not follow. His gaze moved from her face to her neck where the collar of her coat had torn open, and she saw his jaw lock. Because beneath the coat, visible now against the pale skin of her collarbone, were the edges of older scars. Thin white lines where claws had raked her. A circular burn the size of a coin where someone had pressed a heated poker to her skin during a pack disciplinary session. The faded pink ridge of a wolfsbane whip mark that wound across her throat like a necklace. She had 19 scars in total. She knew the exact number because she had counted them once in the storage room on a night when the cold was bad enough that she could not sleep and had nothing to do but take inventory of her own damage. She was not going to tell him that. "I am fine," she said again. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something that made her breath stop. He released her hand, shrugged off his coat, a heavy black thing lined with wolf fur that probably cost more than everything she had ever owned combined, and he draped it around her shoulders. The weight of it was immediate and shocking. It smelled like him cedar and iron and rain, and it was warm from his body, and she could not remember the last time she had been warm. He turned to the pups. 7 small faces stared up at him with the wide-eyed terror of children who have just lived through something that will appear in their nightmares for years. Kalen crouched. He was still enormous even at their level, his knees in the dirt, his armored frame blocking the wind. He looked at Ren, who was still clutching the hem of Ilara's coat. "Are you hurt?" he asked the boy. Ren shook his head. Kalen nodded. Then he looked at the other pups, one by one. None of them were injured. Every arrow had been caught by the fence, the dirt, or Ilara. "She protected you," Kalen said to the children, and his voice when he said it was different. Not softer exactly, but stripped of its edge, the way you might hold a blade, flat so a child can see it without being cut. "Yes," said Ren. "She always protects us." Kalen stood. He looked at Ilara. The calculation behind his eyes was complete, and whatever answer he had arrived at was carved into his expression like text in granite. "Always," he repeated. Ilara realized with a plummeting feeling in her stomach that he meant to investigate, that he was not going to let this go, that the Alpha King of the Shadow Ridge Pack, the most powerful wolf on the continent, a man she had never met before this morning, was standing in the mud of a border town pup council with his coat around her shoulders and her blood on his hands, and he was looking at her as if she were the only real thing in the world. She needed to leave, because what Kalen Voss didn't know, what no one in Greymoor knew, what Ilara herself had only half understood, until this very moment when her wolf stirred from its 7-year silence and pressed against the inside of her ribs like a caged thing, hearing the key turn was that she was not what she appeared to be. She was not a wolfless Omega. She was not weak. She was something else entirely, something her mother had spent the last hours of her life binding and hiding and burying so deep that even Ilara could not reach it. And the bond she had just felt, that devastating pulse of recognition that had turned Kalen Voss's amber eyes to black, was going to unravel everything her mother had died to protect. Rowan returned with the Greymoor Alpha in under 20 minutes, which told Ilara that Halden Thorpe had not been very far away and had been very motivated to respond quickly when the Shadow Ridge Pack's second-in-command appeared at his door. He came into the council yard at a half-jog, his face flushed above his silver beard, wearing a formal coat thrown hastily over sleep clothes. He was a large man, thick through the middle, with the heavy, authoritative features of a wolf who had been alpha of a mid-tier pack for 2 decades and had grown comfortable in the role. Behind him trailed his beta, a lean man named Silas, with a narrow face and restless eyes, who had personally administered 3 of Ilara's 19 scars. Halden stopped short when he saw Kalen. "Your Majesty," he said, and the deference in his voice was layered over a poorly concealed panic. "We were not informed of your visit. Had we known you were inspecting the border territories?" "I was not inspecting," Kalen said. "I was passing through when my wolves heard arrow fire from your pup council. Your pup council Alpha Thorpe, which is within 500 yards of your own lodge." Halden's eyes darted to the scene, the broken arrows, the blood on the fence, the captured mercenary now bound and gagged and lying on the ground where Rowan had dropped him. Then his eyes found Ilara, and something complicated moved across his face. It was not guilt exactly. Ilara had learned long ago not to mistake discomfort for conscience. Holden looked at her the way you might look at a tool that had been left out in the rain. Irritation faintly at the inconvenience. "Elara," he said. "What happened here? Not what are you hurt or are the pups safe? What happened?" As if she had caused it. 5 mercenaries, she said, armed with wolfsbane-tipped arrows. They wanted the Whitmore boy. Holden's face went grey. The Whitmore boy. Wren. Son of one of Greymoor's few remaining families with old bloodline ties to the Northern Council. If anyone was going to send mercenaries for a specific pup, it would be for political leverage, and the fact that it had happened on Holden's watch, under his territory's protection, in his own council grounds, was the kind of failure that could end an alpha's tenure. "Silas," he said sharply, "get a patrol to the eastern perimeter. Full sweep. Now." Silas moved to go. Kaelin raised one hand, barely a gesture, and Silas froze mid-stride, as if he had hit an invisible wall. "Your beta stays," Kaelin said. "I have questions." Holden's mouth opened and closed. He was not accustomed to being commanded, but the power rolling off Kaelin was not something you argued with. It was a physical force, a pressure against the eardrums, a weight on the shoulders. Even Elara, wrapped in his coat with his scent, filling her lungs, felt it, though for her it manifested differently. Not as oppression, as gravity, as a center of mass that her whole body wanted to orbit. She forced herself to focus. The arrow in her shoulder was getting harder to ignore. The pain had moved from sharp to deep, a throbbing ache that pulsed with her heartbeat, and the wolfsbane on the tip was doing something unpleasant to the edges of the wound, a slow chemical burn that made her skin feel like it was tightening. "The woman who protected your pups," Kaelin said to Holden. "What is her name?" Holden blinked. He looked at Elara as if seeing her for the first time. She is one of our Omegas," he said. "She watches the children." Her name Kaelin repeated, and the temperature in the council yard dropped perceptibly. Elara Holden said. "Elara Vane." Kaelin's head turned. Vane. The name meant something to him. Elara could see it, a flicker of recognition there, and gone. "And the scars on her body," Kaelin said, still looking at Elara. "Who put them there?" The silence that followed was the loudest sound Elara had ever heard. Holden did not answer immediately. His eyes went to Silas. Silas, to his credit, did not look at Elara at all. He kept his gaze fixed on a point somewhere above Kaelin's left shoulder, and his face was perfectly blank, and that blankness told Kaelin everything he needed to know, because Kaelin was not a man who missed things. He had ended the border wars not through brute strength alone, but through a preternatural ability to read the dynamics of a room, to see the power lines, and fear lines and loyalty lines that connected people, and what he saw now in the council yard of this unremarkable border town was a picture that made his wolf want to tear through his skin. An Omega covered in scars. A Beta who would not look at her. An Alpha who did not know her name. "We will discuss this at length," Kaelin said to Holden, and the way he said at length made Holden flinch. "But first," he turned to Elara, "you are coming with me to the healer. Now. I do not need 3 arrows," Kaelin said. "Wolfsbane tips. 1 through your hand. You are swaying on your knees. You are coming with me, and you are coming with me now. And this is not a request." Elara looked at him, at his jaw set like a plough blade, at his amber eyes, which had not returned to their normal color since he first saw her, at his bare forearms since she was wearing his coat corded with muscle and laced with old battle scars of his own, and she felt the bond pulse between them like a second nervous system, and she wanted desperately to lean into it, to let it carry her because she was so tired. She was so unbearably tired of being the only wall between fragile things and sharp ones. But she had survived this long by not leaning on anyone. "The pups," she said. "Rowan will guard them," Kaelin said. "With her life." The red-haired woman inclined her head, and there was something in her expression that Elara had never seen directed at her before. Respect. Elara stood. The world tilted. Kaelin caught her by the elbow, and the contact sent another shock wave of warmth through her, and she closed her eyes against it, because she was afraid that if she looked at him right now, she would cry. And she hadn't cried in front of another person since she was 12 years old, and she was not going to start with a king. The healer's tent was one of Kaelin's traveling field stations, set up at the edge of the council grounds with the efficient speed of a military operation. Elara sat on a wooden cot, while a healer named Fen, a wiry man with gentle hands and spectacles, removed the arrows from her body with the practiced calm of someone who had done this many times. The one in her shoulder was the worst. Wolfsbane had seeped into the muscle, and Fen had to irrigate the wound with a solution that smelled like eucalyptus and salt before packing it with a poultice that burned briefly and then went blissfully, wonderfully numb. Elara breathed out. Kaelin stood in the entrance of the tent. He had not left. He had not spoken since they arrived, except to tell Fen to check her hand first, because she had caught an arrow in it. He leaned against the tent pole with his arms crossed over his chest, and he watched Fen work with the focused attention of a man cataloguing evidence. "You have healed from wolfsbane exposure," before Fen said to Elara, not as a question. He was looking at the old scars on her arms, at the particular texture of skin that has been chemically burned and regrown. Multiple times. Elara said nothing. Her healing rate. Fen continued, now looking over his spectacles at Kaelin, "is unusual for an Omega. The wolfsbane should have spread further by now. She is metabolizing it at roughly 3 times the expected rate." Kaelin's eyes did not leave Elara's face. "What would cause that?" he asked. Fen hesitated. "A stronger wolf, alpha-level healing factor. Or what?" Fen cleaned his spectacles on the hem of his shirt, a habitual gesture that bought him a moment to choose his words. "Or lineage. Certain bloodlines carry accelerated healing as a genetic trait. The old bloodlines. Moonborn." The word landed in the tent like a dropped stone. Moonborn. Elara had not heard that word spoken aloud since her mother died, whispering it into her ear in the dark of a burning house, along with instructions and apologies, and a binding ritual that had locked Elara's wolf away so deep that she had spent 7 years thinking it was dead. Elara's heart rate spiked. She felt it, and she knew Kaelin could hear it. "I am not moonborn," she said. Kaelin studied her. The expression on his face was unreadable, but she could feel the bond between them like a taut wire, and through it she could sense something unexpected. He was not suspicious. He was not angry. He was patient. He was waiting the way a hunter waits by a trail, knowing the deer will come because the tracks are fresh and the wind is right. Fen Kaelin said, "Give us the tent." Fen gathered his instruments and left without argument. The tent flap closed. The sounds of the camp outside became muffled. Inside, the light was amber from the oil lamp, and the air smelled of eucalyptus and poultice herbs and cedar smoke, and Kaelin Voss was 3 feet away from her, and Elara could hear her own breathing, and his, and nothing else. "Your name is Elara Vane," he said. "Yes. Your mother was Maren Vane." Elara's blood went cold. "How do you know my mother's name?" Kaelin uncrossed his arms. He reached into the inner pocket of his mail shirt and withdrew a folded piece of leather old and stained, and he opened it on the cot beside her. Inside was a charcoal sketch, small, rough, drawn with skill, but no time. It showed a woman with dark hair and sharp features holding an infant, and around them both was a pattern of curved lines that Elara recognized because her mother had drawn the same pattern on the inside of her wrist the night of the fire. A binding circle. Your mother, Kaelin said, came to my father 23 years ago. I was 12. She came in the night, carrying you. She said she was moon-born, the last of the Vane line, and that someone was hunting her bloodline to extinction. She asked for sanctuary. Elara's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs. My father refused, Kaelin said. And the way he said it, flat and without excuse, was worse than any justification could have been. He was afraid. The Moonborn were being purged by the Northern Council. Sheltering you would have brought war to our gates, and we were not yet strong enough. My father was a pragmatic man. He turned your mother away. Elara felt the words land in her chest, like stones in still water, each one sending ripples outward, through years of not knowing, years of asking why. Your mother died 3 months later, Kaelin said, in a fire set by council hunters. But you survived, because of what she did to you. The binding. He said it with certainty, not guessing. How long have you known, Elara whispered. Since I was 17, he said. When my father died and I became Alpha, I found his records. Every alliance he refused, every mercy he withheld. I have carried that list since then, and your mother's name was on it. He looked at her. The amber of his eyes was shot through with something she could not name. Regret, maybe, or its angrier cousin. I have been looking for you for 6 years, Elara. She could not breathe. The tent was too small. The bond was too loud. Her wolf was pressing against the binding, like water against a dam, and the dam was cracking. She could feel it, hairline fractures, spreading through the structure her mother had built to keep her safe. And safety and prison had been the same thing for so long that she could no longer tell which walls were which. You cannot be looking for me, she said. You did not know I existed until. I knew a Moonborn child survived a council purge, he said. I knew she would be roughly my age. I knew the binding would mask her wolf, make her appear Omega or wolfless. I had scouts checking border packs for 6 years, looking for a woman with no wolf and Moonborn level healing. He paused. I did not expect to find my mate. The word shattered something in her. Mate, spoken aloud by him in this amber-lit tent, with the smell of her own blood still in the air, and she could feel the bond roaring between them now, not a whisper, but a river, and her wolf was howling behind the binding, howling and howling, and she put her hands over her face because she was going to break. Kaelin did not touch her. He stood perfectly still 3 feet away, and he let her have the moment. The discipline it cost him was visible in the tendons of his neck, in the locked set of his shoulders. His wolf wanted to close the distance. She could feel that through the bond, the pulling, the desperate gravitational need. But he stood his ground because she had put her hands over her face, and he understood what that meant. It meant she needed a wall more than she needed a bridge, and he would be neither until she chose. I cannot be your mate, she said through her fingers. You already are. I am an Omega. I am nothing. I watch pups for table scraps, and I sleep on a mat in a storage room, and I own nothing, and I know nothing, and you caught an arrow with your bare hand to protect a child who is not yours, Kaelin said. You have 19 scars, and you earned every one of them standing between something fragile and something sharp. You are not nothing. You are the most terrifying person I have ever met." Ilara dropped her hands. She stared at him. "Terrifying," she repeated. "A wolf who has been beaten for 7 years and still fights," he said. "Who has been starved and still stands. Who catches arrows. What do you think happens when the binding breaks and you get your wolf back?" She had not thought about it. She had spent so long believing her wolf was dead that the possibility of its return was like being told the sun might rise in the west tomorrow. Theoretically interesting, practically destabilizing. "I do not want it to break," she said. And it was a lie, the first lie she had ever told, that her wolf punished her for. A sharp spike of pain behind her eyes, a rebuke. Kalen tilted his head. He heard the lie. Of course he did. "We will not discuss this further today," he said. "You are injured. You need rest. But I am not leaving this territory until the mercenaries are traced back to whoever sent them, and the matter of your pack's failure to protect its own pups is addressed." He moved toward the tent flap. Stopped. "One more thing. The scars. I know you have 19. Fen counted the tissue signatures while he worked. I want to know who gave you each one. And I want to know today. And I am going to ask you, and not them, because I trust your account, and I do not trust theirs." She stared at his back. How could he have known? How could a healer working for less than an hour have counted scars that Ilara herself had only catalogued over years? Unless Kalen had told him to count. Unless Kalen had been counting from the moment he first saw her on the ridge, tracking every visible mark on her body with the precision of a man building a case. He left the tent, and Ilara sat in the amber light with his coat still around her shoulders, and the warmth of the bond still pulsing in her chest and the binding cracking inside her. And she thought for the first time in 7 years, what if the cage opens, and I am not nothing inside it? Kalen's investigation took 3 days. 3 days during which Ilara learned that the Alpha King of the Shadow Ridge Pack didn't operate the way she had imagined kings operated. He did not hold court or make speeches or sit in judgment with ceremony. He moved through the Greymore compound like a surgeon through a body, opening things up, looking at what was inside, making no expression that betrayed his findings. He interviewed every pack member who had interacted with Ilara. He did this personally, not through Rowan or any of his war council. He sat across from each wolf in Halden Thorpe's own study, which he had commandeered without apology, and he asked questions in his low, flat voice, and Ilara knew this because Wren told her. Wren had taken to following Kalen at a distance, the way a barn cat follows someone who has once given it food. Kalen tolerated this with a patience that surprised Ilara. On the second morning she found Wren sitting on the porch of the study, eating an apple that Kalen had apparently handed him on his way inside, and the boy reported the morning's proceedings with the unfiltered candor of a 4-year-old. He asked Mrs. Polk about your arm. Wren said, juice running down his chin. The burn one. Mrs. Polk said it was an accident. Then the king asked what kind of accident leaves a perfect circle, and Mrs. Polk started crying. Ilara's stomach turned. She did not want this. She had survived by being invisible, by enduring without complaint, by making herself so small and useful that the pack's cruelty became infrequent rather than daily. Kalen was pulling her scars into the light, like pulling threads from a garment, and she was afraid of what would be left when he was done. On the second day, Silas disappeared. No one saw him leave. One moment the beta's quarters were occupied. His coat hung on the peg by the door, his boots by the bed. The next, everything personal was gone. He had slipped out through the eastern perimeter, sometime after midnight, and Kaelin's wolves tracked his scent to the river crossing before it dissolved in the current. Kaelin received this news from Rowan while standing in the council yard. Ilara was nearby, supervising the pups as usual, though now with 2 Shadow Ridge guards posted at the yard's entrances. She watched Kaelin's face as Rowan spoke. He did not look surprised. He looked confirmed. "The beta ran," Rowan said. "Guilt." "Yes," Kaelin said. "But not just guilt about the Omega. He ran because the mercenaries will be traced back to him. He arranged the attack." Ilara's hands went still on the wooden toy she had been carving for Ren. A small wolf, rough-shaped something to help the boy sleep after the nightmares that had started since the arrow attack. "Silas," she said. Kaelin turned to her. "He arranged for mercenaries to attack the pup council," Kaelin said. "The Whitmore boy was the stated target, but I do not believe he was the actual target." "The actual target was you." Ilara set down the carving. Her mind was working through it now, rearranging the pieces. Silas, who had administered 3 of her scars during pack disciplinary sessions. Silas, who had been beta for 9 years, and who looked at Ilara sometimes with an expression she had never been able to classify. Not hatred, not contempt, fear. "Why would Silas want me dead?" she said. "Because he knows what you are," Kaelin said. "Or suspects it. A moonborn wolf, hidden in a border pack, bound so her wolf cannot emerge, is a sleeping weapon. Eventually the binding fades. Eventually the wolf wakes. And a moonborn wolf in a pack this small would shift the power balance of the entire territory." He said it simply. As fact. "Silas has been reporting to the Northern Council," Kaelin continued. "I believe he has been doing so since before your mother's death. I believe he is the reason the council hunters found her." The world stopped. Ilara stood in the council yard in the weak afternoon sun, with a half-carved wolf in her hands, and Kaelin's coat around her shoulders. It had not occurred to her to return it, and he had not asked, and she thought about Silas. Silas, who had arrived in Greymoor when she was 4 years old. Silas, who had been promoted to beta the same year her mother died. Silas, who administered discipline with a thin smile and careful hands, never enough damage to kill, always enough to remind her what she was, what she could not be allowed to become. 13 years, she said. "He watched me for 13 years, and hurt you for 13 years, Kaelin said, "to keep you small, to keep the wolf from waking. Pain suppresses the shift, especially in bound wolves. Every scar he gave you was a lock on the cage." She looked at the carving in her hands. The small wooden wolf half-formed the grain of the wood, still rough under her fingers. She had been carving it with a kitchen knife, working by feel and memory, shaping something she had never seen with her own eyes, because her wolf had been sealed away before she was old enough to shift. She did not cry. She had used up her allowance of breaking in the healer's tent and could not afford another. Instead, she felt something else, something that came from deeper than grief and was older than anger. Her wolf shifted inside the binding, not straining this time, stretching, testing, like a sleeper turning over, reaching toward the light, Ilara Kaelin said, and his voice had that stripped-down quality she had heard when he spoke to the pups. "I want to see," she said. "My wolf. I want to see what I am." He held her gaze, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something on his face that was not control or patience or calculation. It was hope, raw and unconcealed and startling on a face built for war. "I can break the binding," he said. "A moonborn binding is keyed to blood and intent. Your mother's blood, your mother's intent to protect. But a mate bond is older magic, stronger." She understood. He was telling her that the bond between them, the thing she had been trying to hold at arm's length for 3 days, was the key. Not the only key, but the most direct one. And using it would mean accepting it. She looked at him across the council yard, this man who had counted her scars, who had traced her mother's name through decades of records, who stood in a border town he had no reason to visit, because he heard arrow fire and came running, and she felt the terrible weight of having been found. "Not yet," she said. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. Once, and he did not push. That night, Ilara lay on the cot in the healer's tent, which Kaelan had insisted on, rather than the storage room, and she held the half-carved wolf up to the lamp and tried to feel the shape inside the wood, the way her mother had taught her to feel things, by texture, by warmth, by the grain's willingness to give. Her wolf stirred again. Closer now. She could almost feel its shape inside her the way she could feel the wolf inside the wood. There. Just there. Waiting. On the 4th morning, the mercenary talked. Rowan had a talent for interrogation that involved no raised voices and no visible violence, just a patient, unblinking presence, and an ability to ask the same question 17 different ways, until the answer emerged from the cracks in the subject's story like water through stone. The mercenary was a contract wolf from the Iron Fang territory, hired through a middleman who had been hired by Silas, who had been receiving instructions from a member of the Northern Council identified only by a seal pressed in black wax. The target was not the Whitmore boy. The target was the Omega who watched the pups. The Whitmore boy was a cover story, something to make the attack look political rather than personal. The instructions had been specific. Kill the Omega quietly. Make it look like she died protecting the pups. A heroic accident. Regrettable. The kind of death of a border pack would mourn for an afternoon and forget by evening. Kaelan heard this report standing in the doorway of Holden Thorpe's study, with the Greymore Alpha seated behind his own desk, and Ilara watched Kaelan's face as Rowan delivered each detail, and she saw the moment the control slipped. It was brief, a tremor in his right hand, the hand that had held hers in the council yard that had been warm and steady and careful. Now it shook just once, a single involuntary spasm, and then it was still again. But his eyes had gone full black, Holden Thorpe Kaelan said, and his voice was a thing of terrible calm. Your beta orchestrated the attempted murder of a pack member under your protection in coordination with the Northern Council. And you didn't know. This is either complicity or incompetence, and I am going to let you choose which confession you prefer. Helden's face was ashen. He looked nothing like the assured, thick-bodied Alpha who had jogged into the council yard 4 days ago. He looked smaller, diminished, as if Kaelan's presence had been eroding him the way water erodes limestone, slowly and then all at once. I did not know about Silas Holden. Said, I swear on my bloodline, Your Majesty, I did not know about the council connection. And here was the moment Ilara saw something she didn't expect. Because Holden looked at her then, and his face did something complicated. Not guilt, but a wince, deep and genuine, as if something had shifted in his understanding, and the new position was uncomfortable. She is moonborn, he said quietly. Maren's daughter, I suspected. Years ago. Maren came to me first, before she went to your father. She asked me to hide Ilara. I said yes. I assigned her Omega status to keep her invisible. I thought it would protect her. He pressed his thick fingers against his eyelids. I did not realize Silas was part of it. I thought the disciplinary measures were standard, Pack management. I did not look closely because I did not want to see. Elara stared at him. Heldon Thorpe, the man she had despised for 3 years as an indifferent tyrant, he had known. He had hidden her on purpose. The Omega designation, the menial work, the invisibility. It was not neglect. It was a disguise so thorough that even Elara had believed it. But the scars, she said. The pain. You let Silas... Heldon didn't look up. He kept his fingers pressed against his eyelids, and his shoulders were bowed, and Elara saw him clearly for the first time. Not a villain. A coward. A man who had made a promise to her dying mother, and kept the letter of it while the spirit rotted, who had hidden the child, but had not watched the hiding place, who had built a shelter, and not noticed when the roof began to leak. There was no forgiveness in that distinction. But there was dimension. And dimension was worse than flat evil, because it meant the world was more complicated than she wanted it to be. Kaelin looked at Holden for a long time. Then he spoke. You will step down as Alpha of Greymoor. Your successor will be chosen by pack vote, under Shadow Ridge oversight. Your remaining years will be spent in service to your pack, in whatever capacity your successor assigns. This is Mercy Thorpe, and I am extending it for one reason only. The woman you failed was my mate's mother, and my mate is watching, and I will not perform cruelty in front of her. Holden nodded. He did not argue. He did not look up. Kaelin turned to Elara. Come, he said, and Elara went, because the walls she had built were crumbling, and behind them wasn't nothing. Behind them was a wolf that stirred and stretched and pressed its nose toward the light, and the only person in the world who knew how to open the cage was walking ahead of her, holding the door. They left Greymoor on the 5th morning. Elara had expected to ride in the supply wagon with the equipment and the prisoners. Instead, Kaelin put her on his own horse, a massive black warhorse named Sable that smelled like leather oil and grain, and bore Kaelin's weight and hers together without complaint. Kaelin sat behind her in the saddle with one arm around her waist, and she could feel his heart beat against her back, slow and steady, and the bond between them hummed like a plucked string. She did not ask where they were going. She knew. Shadow Ridge, his territory, his home, the seat of the most powerful pack on the continent, carved into the black granite mountains of the northern range like a fortress grown from the stone itself. She also knew what was coming, and she was afraid of it. You are shaking, Kaelin said into her hair. I am cold, she lied. You are a terrible liar, he said. His arm tightened around her waist. Not possessively, protectively. The way you hold something when you know it might try to fly away. What happens when we get there? She said. You will have quarters. Warm ones. A healer on staff. Fen will stay assigned to your care until the wolfsbane damage is fully healed. You will eat from the main table, not from scraps. And when you are ready, not before, we will address the binding. And if I am never ready, then you will still have quarters and a healer and food from the main table. The binding is yours, Elara. Your mother built it. Only you can choose to take it down. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that a king could want her without conditions, that the bond was not a leash that she could be found without being owned. But she had been a possession for so long, a pack's least thing, a tool to be used and shelved, that the concept of being chosen without conditions was as foreign as sunlight to a cave fish. They rode in silence for a while. The trees thickened, the air cooled, the path climbed. Rowan pulled her horse alongside them, and spoke to Kaelin about border logistics and patrol rotations, and a pending trade dispute with the Iron Fang territory, and Ilara listened without trying to absorbing the rhythms of Shadow Ridge governance, the way Kaelin made decisions. He was not impulsive, he was not cruel. He listened. He asked questions. He deferred to Rowan's expertise on matters of ground tactics and to Fenn's judgment on medical priorities. And twice during the ride, he asked Ilara questions. Not about the binding or her identity. About Greymore. About the pups. About the lumber trade and the border patrol schedules. And the tannery output things she knew because she had lived in the gaps of that community for 3 years, invisible enough to see everything. She answered. Carefully at first, then, with growing detail because she realized he was not making small talk. He was mapping the territory through her eyes, using her vantage point, the Omega's view from below, to see what the Alpha's view from above would miss. And he was doing it with genuine attention, the kind that remembered what you said and came back to it later. On the second night of the ride, Kaelin assigned her a separate tent, positioned directly beside his own. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the Shadow Ridge camp wolves murmuring the crack of a fire. Someone sharpening a blade with slow, methodical strokes. And she felt safer than she had felt in 13 years. Her wolf pressed against the binding. The cracks were wider now. She could feel it in moments of strong emotion, when Kaelin's arm tightened around her waist, when Wren's face flashed in her memory, when she held the half-carved wolf and thought about what she might become. Each time the binding flexed and groaned, and each time she pulled back from the edge. Not yet. Not yet. On the third morning they crested the ridge, and Ilara saw Shadow Ridge for the first time. It was not what she expected. She had imagined something dark and martial, a fortress of stone and iron, befitting the most feared Alpha King on the continent. And there was stone, yes, massive granite walls built into the mountainside towers that rose from the cliff face like teeth. But inside the walls, visible even from the ridge, were gardens, greenhouses with glass roofs, catching the morning light. Smoke rising from chimneys that meant kitchens and forges and healing halls. Children's voices carrying up the mountain on the cold, thin air. It was a city, a living, working city, built for war and used for life. "Welcome home," Kaelin said behind her. The words were quiet, almost uncertain, as if he was not sure she would accept them. She looked at the city in the mountain, and she felt her wolf press against the binding one more time, and this time the binding didn't hold. The crack was audible. Not a physical sound, not something anyone else could hear, but inside her skull it was like the snap of a frozen branch, sharp and clean and final. The binding her mother had woven 23 years ago, blood magic and intent and desperate love, fractured along every stress line that pain and time and the mate bond had carved into it, and Ilara gasped as something unfolded inside her chest. It was enormous, not in size, in presence, in density, in the sheer concentrated weight of a wolf that had been compressed into a space the size of a fist for 2 decades, and was now expanding, filling her, reshaping the architecture of her body from the inside. Her eyes burned. She felt Kaelin's arm lock around her waist, felt him go rigid against her back as he sensed what was happening through the bond. Sable danced nervously beneath them. Ilara Kaelin said, "Breathe." She could not breathe. Her wolf was enormous, and it was ancient, and it was silver. She could see the color of it behind her closed eyelids. A silver so bright it was almost white, the color of moon-born wolves, the color her mother must have been. And it was furious. Not at her, at everything that had been done to her. She felt it flood through the bond to Kaelin, 23 years of caged rage channeled through the connection between them, and she heard him make a sound she had never heard from him before. A sharp intake of breath, not pain, awe. "Rowan," he said, and his voice was rough. "Get the pack to the courtyard. Now. All of them." "What is happening?" Rowan asked already, wheeling her horse. "My mate is waking up," Kaelin said, "and they need to see this." Ilara tried to speak. What came out was not words. It was a sound from somewhere below, language below, thought a vibration that came from her wolf and passed through her vocal cords and echoed off the granite walls of Shadow Ridge like a bell being struck. The wolves in the camp below stopped what they were doing. Every single one. She could feel them, hundreds of wolves, turning toward the ridge, where she sat on the black horse with the Alpha King's arm around her, and their attention was a physical weight. But her wolf bore it easily, because her wolf was made. For this had always been made for this. She opened her eyes. They were silver. She knew because Kaelin turned her face toward him, and she saw herself reflected in the black of his pupils, silver-eyed and glowing, and the look on his face was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Not triumph, not possession, relief. The relief of a man who has been searching for 6 years and has finally found what he was looking for. "There you are," he said. The days that followed were a reconstruction. Ilara was given quarters in the eastern wing of the main hall, a room with stone walls and a wood floor, and a window that looked out over the greenhouses. It had a bed with actual blankets, thick wool and linen, and a wardrobe empty, waiting to be filled. Fen came twice a day to monitor her healing, and the wolf's emergence, which was still ongoing. The binding had cracked, but the wolf was waking slowly, in stages, the way a person surfaces from a deep sleep. She ate from the main table. The food at Shadow Ridge was not fancy, but it was abundant and hot, and she ate with both hands the first night, while Rowan sat across from her and said nothing, and Kaelin sat at the head of the table and watched her with an expression that might have been satisfaction, except that it was also terribly sad. Because every time she flinched at a loud noise, every time she hesitated before sitting down, as if expecting to be told to move, every time she wrapped bread in a napkin and tucked it into her pocket for later, out of habit born from years of uncertain meals, he saw it. He catalogued it the way he catalogued everything, and each observation was another line on a ledger that would eventually come due. On the 3rd day, at Shadow Ridge, Ilara found the training yard. She was not looking for it. She was exploring carefully the way a feral cat explores a new building, always near a wall, always aware of exits. The training yard was a wide-open space, bounded by stone walls and packed earth, and when she found it, there was a class in session. 12 young wolves, teenagers learning combat forms under the instruction of a scarred older wolf who moved with the economy of a career fighter. Ilara sat on the wall and watched. After 20 minutes, Kaelin sat down beside her. He did this without announcement, without ceremony. Just appeared and sat close enough that she could feel the heat of him, far enough that she could leave if she wanted. "Silas," she said, without preamble. "He taught me to be afraid of pain. Every disciplinary session, every scar he was conditioning me, making pain the dominant sensation, keeping the wolf asleep under layers of trauma." Kaelin was quiet, but it was not just pain that suppressed the shift, she continued. It was also absence. No one touched me gently. No one was warm to me. The wolf responds to connection, to pack bonds. Silas made sure I had none. She looked at the young wolves in the yard, throwing each other laughing, touching casually, the easy physicality of wolves who had never been denied contact. The binding was already weakening, she said. Before I met you. The pups. Wren, especially. He hugged me every day. His warmth was cracking the binding from the inside, slowly. That is why Silas sent the mercenaries when he did. He was running out of time. Kaelin's hand rested on the stone wall between them, not reaching for her. Present. Your wolf, he said. What does it feel like? She thought about it. The wolf was still emerging, flexing into spaces that had been empty for decades, and the sensation was difficult to describe. Like remembering a language you spoke as an infant, she said. The grammar is there, but the vocabulary has to be relearned. He nodded. Then carefully, as if approaching a subject he had been circling for days. The Northern Council sent Silas. They wanted you dead because moon-born wolves are a threat to their authority. But Silas has been missing for 5 days. My scouts have found no trace. That means someone is helping him, someone with resources enough to hide a wolf from my trackers. Elara looked at him. They will come for me, she said. They will come for both of us, he corrected. A moon-born wolf mated to the Alpha King shifts the continental power balance. The Council will not tolerate it. And what will you do? What I have been doing since I was 17. I will count their moves. I will be patient. And when they overreach, I will end them. He said it without bravado. The way you might say, I will make dinner or I will walk the dog. Matter of fact. Certain. And Elara, who had spent her life afraid of powerful men, felt no fear at all because Kaelin's violence was not random or performative. It was structural. He did not break things to feel strong. He broke things that threatened what he had chosen to protect. And he had chosen to protect her. That night, Elara sat in her room and carved. She had acquired a proper set of carving tools from the Shadow Ridge wood shop, and the half-finished wolf from Greymoor was taking shape under her hands. The grain of the wood was hemlock pale and fine-grained, and the wolf emerging from it was not the small toy she had originally intended for Wren. It was larger, more detailed. The haunches were coiled, the head was turned, the ears were pricked forward in attention. She was carving her own wolf, the one she could feel inside her silver and enormous and still waking. A knock at her door. She opened it. Kaelin stood in the hallway in shirt sleeves, his mail and coat set aside for the evening, and he looked uncertain. It was startling on him, like seeing a mountain apologize for its height. I need to tell you something, he said. May I come in? She stepped aside. He entered and stood by the window looking out at the dark shapes of the greenhouses below. He did not sit. She returned to her chair and her carving and waited because she was learning that Kaelin communicated better when he was not the center of attention, when the other person was doing something with their hands. The count, he said, of your scars. 19. She nodded. Fen identified the tissue signatures. 3 from Silas, as you told me. But the others the older ones, the ones from before Greymoor. Fen says they are not from wolves. Elara's hands stilled on the carving. 7 of your scars carry the specific tissue signature of wolfsbane-coated silver blades, Kaelin said. Council hunter weapons. You were wounded by council hunters before your mother died. Before you were bound. She looked at the half-carved wolf, at the pale wood under her fingers. I was 2 years old, she said. Yes, Kaelin said. You were 2 years old, and they cut you 7 times, and your mother bound your wolf to save your life, because a moon-born pup with an active wolf heals too visibly, and they would have found you by the blood trail. She did not bind you to hide you from the world. She bound you to hide you from the wounds, so you could heal at normal speed. So the scars would stay. He turned from the window and looked at her, and his face was stripped of everything except the thing he had been carrying since he was 17 and found his father's ledger. Your scars were the cost of your survival. And every time someone in Greymore saw them and called you weak, every time Silas added a new one and told you it was discipline, they were looking at the evidence of your mother's last act of love and using it to hurt you. And I am going to dismantle every structure that made that possible, Ilara, slowly and completely. And I am telling you this now because you deserve to know my intent, and because I will not pretend to be anything other than what I am. She set down the carving. She stood. She crossed the room to where he stood by the window, and she put her wounded hand, healed now but still pink and tender, against the scar on his cheek. He went perfectly still. The way a predator stills when touched by something it does not want to frighten. "Who gave you this one?" she asked. "My father," he said, "for crying at my mother's funeral." I was 11. They stood in the dark room, with her hand on his face, and the hemlock wolf watching from the table, and the greenhouses glinting below, and Ilara felt the last of the binding give way. Not with a crack this time, with a sigh, like a held breath finally released. Her wolf filled her completely. She felt it settle into her bones, her muscle, her blood, and it was not rage this time, and it was not grief. It was presence, full, heavy, luminous presence, the way a room feels when you finally turn on the light and see that it was never empty. It was just dark. She could feel Kaelin through the bond now, without any barrier, and what she felt was not the controlled, calculated Alpha King she had been dealing with for 2 weeks. It was a man who had been alone with his father's sins for 11 years, who had carried a dead woman's name on a list of failures he inherited, but did not commit, who had searched for a lost child with the systematic patience of a man trying to correct something that could not be corrected, and who, when he found her, was terrified. Terrified that she would not want him, that the bond would not be enough, that he had found his mate, and she would look at his power and see another cage. "I see you," she wanted to say. But those were the wrong words, the cliché words, and they were not what she meant anyway. What she meant was, "I see the boy who was hit for crying and became a king who counts scars." She did not say it. She pressed her forehead against his collarbone instead, and he brought his arms around her, and she felt him exhale a long, slow, emptying the sound of a man setting something down that he has been carrying for a very long time. The Northern Council came on the 12th day. Not with an army, with a delegation. 3 wolves in formal black riding under the council seal, requesting an audience with the Alpha King on matters of continental security. Diplomatic language wrapped around a threat like silk around a blade. Kaelin received them in the great hall of Shadow Ridge, seated on the black granite throne that had been carved from the mountain itself by the first Alpha of his line, and Ilara stood at his right hand because he had asked her to, and because her wolf wanted to be nowhere else. She was changed. 2 weeks of regular meals, proper sleep, and the wolf's emergence had transformed her in ways that were both subtle and unmistakable. She was still slender, still scarred, still quiet in a way that people mistook for timidity. But the silver was in her eyes now, permanently a ring of light around the iris that marked moon-born wolves, and that had not been seen in the continental territories in a generation. And her presence, the weight of her wolf's dominance, filled the hall like smoke. The council delegates felt it. She saw them register it as they entered, a hesitation in their stride, a flicker of something in their eyes. They had come expecting an Omega. They found a moon-born wolf standing beside the throne. The led delegate was a tall woman with steel-grey hair and a sharp, intelligent face. Her name was Councillor Bren, and she had been on the Northern Council for 18 years, and she looked at Ilara with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite respect, but something in between that tasted like recalculation. "Your Majesty," Bren said, "we come regarding the unauthorized harboring of a fugitive moon-born wolf within your territory. The Council's eradication of the moon-born bloodlines was enacted for the stability of—" "Ilara is my mate," Kalen said, cutting her off with the conversational ease of a man swatting a fly. "She is not a fugitive. She is the Luna of Shadow Ridge. And the Council's eradication of the Moonborn was not enacted for stability. It was enacted because the old Council feared any bloodline stronger than their own. You have 30 seconds to reframe your opening statement or leave my hall." Bren's mouth thinned. She was not a fool. She had not survived 18 years on the Council by being inflexible. Ilara watched her recalculate, watched the intelligence behind her eyes weigh options with the speed of a practiced politician. "We acknowledge the mate bond," Bren said carefully, "and we acknowledge the Luna's status within your pack. Our concern is one of precedent. If moon-born wolves are permitted to resurface unchecked, other dormant bloodlines may what Kalen said, live." Bren was silent. "Let me be clear," Kalen said, and he leaned forward on the throne, and the dominance that rolled off him made the stone walls hum. "The moonborn purge is over. It ended the moment I found my mate bleeding in a pup council yard, because one of your agents spent 13 years torturing her to keep her wolf asleep. That agent Silas, formerly Beta of Greymore, is under your protection. I know this because my trackers are the best on the continent, and the only place they cannot reach is the Council stronghold." He stood. He was a head taller than everyone in the room. "You will return Silas to me within 7 days. You will publicly revoke the Moonborn eradication order, and you will recognize Ilara Vane as Luna of Shadow Ridge and sovereign equal under continental law. If you do not, I will come to the Council stronghold myself, and I will not bring a delegation." The silence in the great hall was absolute. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to hold its breath. Bren looked at Ilara, and here in this moment, Ilara saw something in the old councillor's face that surprised her. Not malice. Weariness. The deep bone-level exhaustion of a woman who had spent 18 years enforcing a policy she had inherited from crueler men who had carried out the purge, not out of conviction, but out of institutional momentum, and who was now, perhaps for the first time, being offered an exit. "The Council will convene," Bren said quietly. "You will have our answer within 3 days." She turned and walked out. The other 2 delegates followed. Kalen sat back down. His hand found Ilara's, and he threaded his fingers through hers, and his grip was tight and his palm was damp. She realized with a start that he had been afraid, that the entire performance, the dominance, the threats, the controlled fury had been partly real and partly theatre, and that beneath it he had been terrified that the Council would reject his terms and he would have to go to war with his mate's safety as the stakes. Ilara squeezed his hand. "They will comply," she said. "How do you know?" Because Bren looked relieved. He turned to her. The amber of his eyes was warm. "You read her better than I did," he said. "You were busy being terrifying. I was free to watch." The corner of his mouth twitched. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. The Council complied on the 2nd day. Silas was delivered to Shadow Ridge in irons, escorted by Council guards who left immediately and did not look back. The revocation of the Moonborn eradication order was issued in writing, sealed with the council's mark, and posted to every territory. Cailan dealt with Silas in the open courtyard in front of the assembled pack, because Shadow Ridge justice was public, and Cailan believed that accountability performed in secret was not accountability at all. Silas was thinner than Elara remembered, smaller, without the beta title and the Greymore compound and the power structure that had propped him up. He was just a lean man with a narrow face and nervous eyes, kneeling on packed earth in the afternoon light. Cailan stood before him. Elara stood at the edge of the courtyard, not beside the throne, not in the center. She chose her own position near the wall, where she could see everything and be seen by everyone. Silas looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't expected. Not the fear she had anticipated, not defiance, confusion. Genuine bewildered confusion, as if he could not reconcile the silver-eyed wolf standing by the wall with the bleeding Omega he had disciplined for 13 years. He opened his mouth. "I did not know," he said, "that she would become that. I thought I was preventing a catastrophe. The council told me moon-born wolves go feral, that the binding suppresses a madness, that if her wolf woke, she would destroy everything around her." The courtyard was silent. Elara felt the words settle on her skin. It was the most dangerous kind of lie, the kind the liar believed. "You had 13 years, Cailan said. 13 years to observe her, to watch a girl grow up caring for pups and carving wooden animals and eating scraps without complaint. Did she look like a catastrophe to you?" Silas said nothing. His jaw worked. Did she look like madness? "No," Silas whispered. "She looked like her mother." Elara closed her eyes. Her wolf pressed against her ribs, not in rage, but in something heavier than rage. The weight of being seen by someone who had chosen to hurt her anyway, who had looked at her mother's face in hers, and still held the hot iron. Silas would be held in the Shadow Ridge cells for the remainder of his life. Not executed. Elara had asked for this, and Cailan had agreed without argument, and when she told him why, he had looked at her with an expression that combined confusion and respect in equal measure. "Because death is quick," she said, "and I want him to live long enough to understand what he prevented me from being. I want him to watch me become it." The marking ceremony was held on the night of the new moon in the tradition of the moon-born line, because Elara's mother had told her once, in the burning house, in the dark, while the binding took hold, that moon-born wolves do not mark under moonlight. They mark in the darkness, between moons when only the bond itself provides the light. Elara stood in the great hall of Shadow Ridge, in a dress she had helped make herself, because the court seamstress had offered to produce something elaborate, and Elara had looked at the bolts of silk and brocade, and chosen instead a simple dress of dark blue wool, well-fitted and warm, because warmth was the luxury she valued most. The pack filled the hall. Rowan stood at the front in formal armor. Fen stood near the door with his spectacles slightly crooked, and scattered among the adult wolves, Elara saw something that made her chest ache. Children. Dozens of them. Shadow Ridge pups who had heard about the Omega, who caught arrows, who had incorporated her into their games and their stories, who called her the Arrow Wolf in their play. And there in the front row, wearing a new coat and holding a wooden wolf carved from hemlock, was Wren. Cailan had sent for him specifically, had arranged for his family to travel from Greymore under escort. Wren saw Elara and waved with both hands. She waved back. Cailan came to her through the assembled pack, and the crowd parted for him, not because they feared him, but because the moment demanded it, and he stood before her, and he was not wearing his mail or his formal armor. He was wearing a simple black shirt, with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, and the scar on his cheek was visible, and his amber eyes were bright in the firelight. He took her hand, her scarred hand, the one the arrow had pierced. "I have counted," he said, and his voice carried through the silent hall. "Every scar on your body, every wound you earned standing between the world and someone weaker. I counted them because I needed to know the full measure of who I was claiming. Not an Omega, not a moonborn, not a title or a bloodline or a power. A woman who catches arrows." He raised her hand. The pink scar in her palm caught the light. "This is the hand that saved a child's life. This is the woman I chose. And if any wolf in any territory, on any council, under any authority, raises a hand against her again, I will tear down their house and salt the earth it stood on, and I will do it slowly enough that they understand why." He turned her hand over, pressed his lips to the center of her palm to the scar, and then he tilted his head, baring the side of his neck to her. The hall went silent. Not quiet. Silent. Because the Alpha King, the most dominant wolf alive, was exposing his throat to an Omega in front of his entire pack. It was not submission. It was trust. And it was the most powerful thing Elara had ever witnessed, because power voluntarily lowered is more terrifying than power raised. She brought her mouth to his neck. Her wolf rose in her silver and vast, and her canines descended, and she bit down. The bond exploded. It was not gentle, it was not warm. It was a detonation, a white-hot expansion of connection that blew through them both and radiated outward through the pack bonds like a shockwave, and every wolf in the hall felt it. Elara heard gasps, heard someone, possibly Ren, squeal with excitement, felt Kaelin's hand grip her waist hard enough to leave bruises, and felt his wolf, enormous, black as pitch ancient, pressing against her through the bond with a sound that was half growl and half prayer. She released his neck. The mark gleamed on his skin, silver-edged, moonborn, permanent. Then he bit her, his mouth against the junction of her neck and shoulder, his canines piercing skin. And the pain was nothing. It was a pinprick compared to arrows and burns and wolfsbane whips. But the sensation behind it was everything. She felt his mark take root in her, felt it weave into the bond, felt it seal something that had been open since the moment they met. The hall erupted, wolves howling, stamping the ancient sound of a pack welcoming a Luna. Rowan banged her fist against her armor. Fen polished his spectacles and pretended he was not crying. Ren held up his wooden wolf and howled along with the adults, a high, reedy sound that cut through the deeper voices like a silver thread through dark cloth. Kaelin pressed his forehead against Elara's. His breathing was ragged. His eyes were black. His hand was still on her waist. 19, he said. She looked at him. You had 19 scars, he said. Now you have 20. And this is the last one anyone will ever give you. Elara touched the mark on her neck. It was warm. It throbbed with the rhythm of the bond, and it was different from every other scar she carried, because this one she had chosen. She reached up and touched the mark on his neck, her mark, silver-lined on his skin. 20 for me, she said. 1 for you. I think you are getting the better deal. I know I am, he said. The hall was loud around them, celebration and noise and life, and Elara stood in the center of it, with her mate's hand on her waist, and her wolf singing inside her, and the wooden carving somewhere in Ren's small fists. And she thought about her mother. Not with grief. With recognition. Maren Vane had bound her daughter's wolf in a burning house, knowing it would cost Elara everything: years of pain, years of silence, years of scars. And it had worked. Not perfectly, not kindly, but the child had survived, and the wolf had slept, and when it woke into a world where an alpha king counted scars instead of collecting them. Elara looked at Kaelin, at the scar on his cheek that his father had given him for crying, at the mark on his neck that she had given him for trust, at his amber eyes that were watching her with an expression she could finally name. Not possession, not obsession. Attention. The careful, patient, devastating attention of a man who looks at the world closely enough to see what everyone else misses. She picked up the hemlock wolf from where Wren had set it on the floor to clap. She turned it in her hands. The carving was finished now. The wolf's haunches were coiled, the head was turned, the ears were pricked forward, and the expression on its wooden face was not snarling or howling. It was listening. She set it on the arm of the granite throne, where the firelight caught the pale wood and made it glow. Then she sat down in the throne beside Kaelin's, the Luna's seat carved from the same mountain. And she listened too, to the pack, to the bond, to the wolf inside her, that was finally, after 23 years, awake and warm and home.